Well, we're heading back up Spanish Fork Canyon.
Yes.
Yes. We thought when we were up there shooting the Utah Railway, we came up with this idea because we got up to the Thistle Slide, the old Thistle Slide, and was like, wow, this is the anniversary of the Thistle Slide. It's been
34 years
34 years.
1983. What an event.
At this exact time of year.
Right.
Somewhere mid-April. And
Mid-April when it all slid.
You can't really say what day it happened because it oozed over a period of time. Yeah, it started gently one day and then just refused to stop. The whole mountain.
Yeah, we had a lot of snow that year, and it stayed cold and a lot of snow right up until the first part of April and into May, and then we had some warm days and it just all came
It just
on.
melted, and it flooded Salt Lake City, flooded the whole state. There was water everywhere, and next thing you know, the mountain in Spanish Fork Canyon was no longer the mountain. It was in the canyon.
It was in the canyon.
If the mountain fell down.
Right.
And oh my goodness.
Changed the landscape
and
forever.
One of the most expensive natural disasters in the history of America. No one was hurt, thank God.
No.
But in terms of just the scope of natural disasters, one of the worst.
Yes.
Took a long time to clean up, destroyed an entire town.
Right.
Cut off an entire community from rail service forever.
Forever, yes. I grew up around those trains down there and had to watch the tracks and the crossings, and suddenly it's no more and they're taking the track out. It's just like, wow, missing an old friend.
And US 89 and the other one, 6?
Yep, Highway 6.
6. Both were completely closed.
Yep.
No one could get through, trucks couldn't get through, and the Denver and Rio Grande mainline completely shut down. And they're trying to route things over the UP, and they couldn't handle the traffic. So it was a big mess, and they had to get that line open just as fast as humanly possible.
Right.
Anyway, check this out, the Thistle Slide of 1983. Well, there's certainly a lot of railroading going on in Spanish Fork Canyon, and if you go exploring in the lower part of the canyon, you may notice these old abandoned railroad grades. This is the former D&RG main line that was destroyed by a giant landslide that occurred in 1983, which pushed this huge mound of earth out into the canyon. Needless to say, this blocked the tracks and no trains could get through. It also cut off Highway 6, which is also Highway 89. But the bigger issue immediately was this: water building up behind the slide, flooding the town of Thistle, and threatening the tens of thousands of people living in the lower canyon. This small town, Thistle, was utterly destroyed. There was no time to move anything out of here, and the rising water was just simply unstoppable. 1983 was already shaping up to be a disastrous year in the state of Utah for flooding. In Salt Lake City, all of the streams were over their banks and running in the streets. The community had rallied together to fill thousands of sandbags to control these floodwaters, and it was generally being kept under control. In Thistle, however, there was just nothing that could be done about the rising water. The bigger issue was going to be how to prevent this flood from breaking free of the landslide and taking the whole thing down canyon. The town of Thistle was going to be written off. Keep in mind that in 1983 there really was no such thing as flood insurance. Thistle had sprung to life in the 1870s as the Denver and Rio Grande Western built through the canyon. An entire community sort of sprung up around the railroad and the railroad people. Look at this cool schoolhouse they built, which was still standing at the time of the flood. There was a Y here, and the tail of the Y connected to the Marysvale branch, which fed clear down into central Utah to cities like Mount Pleasant, and all the way to Marysvale, and connections with a couple of narrow-gauge railroads. While the size of the community had diminished a bit by 1983, it was still a major junction on the Rio Grande here in Spanish Fork Canyon. But notice here that the slide is already present in these old photographs. The land had been moving for hundreds of thousands of years. This slide was as inevitable as it was unexpected. With the water rising, the most the crews here could do was to try to stabilize the slide so that it wouldn't break free and destroy the lower canyon. It was also critical to get the highway and the railroad reopened as soon as possible, but first, stabilize the slide and protect the lower canyon. Notice that water is leaking through the slide, and if it continued to do so, it would wash the whole thing away. It was also going to be necessary to figure out some way to get the water out of here safely, a spillway or something. They rigged up this thing, a floating pump system that pumped the water over the slide as they constructed a makeshift spillway to carry the water away from the slide safely once it reached the top of the slide. The spillway was barely finished when the water finally overtopped the slide, and you can see it cascading down the makeshift spillway here. Notice also a railroad tunnel being constructed here on the far left. Other crews were digging a massive cut directly through the mountain to reopen US 6 and 89 to highway traffic. At this point, the lake had become a massive, deep reservoir. These days, the area below the slide looks perfectly safe, and it is. Note the railroad grade here, the old railroad grade and highway below. And the river is flowing nicely again these days through a tunnel under this, the slide, which these days is perfectly stable and beginning to grow some vegetation on the top of it. Yet every year it still moves a little bit. The schoolhouse is long gone. This is after the flood, and as vandals have carried what was left of it away, these days there is absolutely nothing left of the old schoolhouse except for the foundation. This beautiful old historic building lost forever. During the flood, most of the houses actually floated up off of their foundations and broke apart on the surface of the lake and can be found here scattered along the old high water mark around the valley. Now, some structures didn't float away, they just simply were overcome by the rising water. That's what happened to the schoolhouse. And those have re-emerged now. The water's still here to some extent. The whole area has become a giant swamp with a few old houses standing in it. I try to remember that this was someone's house where they had Christmas every year. Oddly enough, the yards and the Y are still here, although you'd never know it. There's about 10 feet of dirt and swamp on top of them, but they never had a chance to remove any of that, and so it's all still there, buried under the ground. These days there are no residents other than, say, the birds and frogs, as the whole area has become something of a swamp. Another casualty of the flood was this, the Rio Grande Zephyr. This was the last vestige of the old California Zephyr, and it was being run by the Rio Grande as America's last privately owned passenger train. They had decided to discontinue it, and those final runs were scheduled and were all canceled because the track was gone. The new mainline, which bypasses the slide, is a pretty amazing piece of railroad track. Simply state-of-the-art because, well, a lot of money was being thrown at this project to rapidly get the line reopened. It climbs a very steep grade here to these two tunnels which were bored under the mountain. As we saw in last week's show, a lot of railroads operate on this track. The Utah Railway, for one, also the Union Pacific, who owns the track. And here we can see a Burlington Northern and Santa Fe train. They have track rights over the line as well. Originally, the Utah Railway had planned to parallel their track down the Marysvale branch out of Thistle and go down Nephi Canyon. But once they got to Thistle, they made arrangements to use this track below Thistle and never built further than Thistle. And they're still operating on this line. In fact, they run all the way north to Ogden these days on Union Pacific Track. As we saw in last week's show, this was originally built to haul coal down out of Carbon County, but there's just not a lot of coal moving around these days. You typically see oil tank cars on the line these days. They're hauling oil down from the Helper area, I believe where it comes out of pipelines, and taking those all the way to the oil refineries in Salt Lake City. So while the coal mines aren't really operating that much, the railroads are as busy as they have ever been. This means that it's still a great place for foaming rail fans to go see trains. After the flood, the Marysvale branch had been really destroyed in the upper part of the canyon and was unsalvageable. However, the bigger issue was that there was no railroad to connect it with, as the new grade was high up on the mountain in a tunnel. And so the line was abandoned and all of the track pulled up and salvaged. Which is why we're going to go explore this ghost railroad for next week's show. Well, that was pretty intriguing, the old Thistle Slide and the great disaster of 1983.
And I forget the way the road was laid out. I used to go that way all the time to go to Spanish Fork, and there was a little coffee shop in the canyon. I couldn't remember how that road went exactly. See pictures? Then I remember, but I don't think I'd ever forget, but it's been a while back.
Yeah, and just amazing to sort of go back over that history.
Right.
And what we figured we'd do now is drive down the Marysvale branch.
Right.
Because that's cool, and they tore that whole thing out.
Mm-hmm.
There's some nifty stuff going on the old Marysvale branch, even though the railroad is long gone.
They need to keep the history of it going.
It's a wonderful old ghost railroad, as it turns out.
Right.
Well, if you liked this movie, do share it with your friends, and you could even hit the thumbs up if you felt so inclined.
Yeah.
The bigger issue is if you're not a subscriber, you want to be a subscriber, because it's a community, and it's all these people, and we all sort of work together and hang out, and that makes us cool.
Right.
And so to become a subscriber, you click on the blue button, zoink, right there. It says subscribe, right? Takes you to the channel, makes you a subscriber, and there's 190 something movies over there right now, and more coming all the time.
Right.
And you can now watch all of those, and you'll be notified whenever we upload the show. Well, we're not sure how you found this movie on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here again next week with some more massive screwing around. See you then.
Okay.
Bye-bye.